And Vendana mentioned Rachel Carson. And I had the privilege when I was a little boy of meeting Rachel Carson, who came to my house at Hickory Hill to give a seminar to my parents. But at that time, Rachel Carson was under attack. When she released Silent Spring in 1961, and then it was serialized in 1962, and it was on the bestseller list longer than any other book in history at that time. And she came under attack not just by the industry, by American Cyanide and Monsanto, which printed 5,000 brochures called on a, they made a parody of Silent Spring called The Desolate Year. It was a parody that was kind of making fun of what the world would be like if we got rid of chemicals, because there would be all this famine and destruction and misery. And they mounted a year-long campaign against her. And, you know, Zen said this was misogynistic. This movement, the chemical movement, is misogynistic. And one of the things that they did at that time, Rachel Carson, incidentally, was dying of cancer. Oh, she never defended herself. But she was derided by a series of euphemisms that were meant to imply, like the word seamstress, which was a contemporary euphemism for lesbianism. And those are the kind of things that Monsanto did. That was the first big campaign before the tobacco campaign. It became the template for all these other campaigns. My uncle and the USDA took the side of Monsanto and the chemical industry against Rachel Carson. My uncle, President Kennedy, opposed his own USDA and appointed an independent panel of scientists who went through Silent Spring and vindicated Rachel Carson on every major assertion in the book. You know, one of the things that I've learned during 33 years as an environmental advocate is that whenever you see large-scale environmental injury, you also see the subversion of democracy, capture of the public agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution. You'll see the corruption of public officials. You'll see the compromise of the press and the other institutions that democracy puts in the way of corporate control. Those institutions are swept aside. And, you know, from when I was a little boy, I was training hawks, and I had a falconry license, and I had a raptor propagation license, and I had a banding license. For almost 50 years, I've climbed up a ridge every autumn in September and October, and I've banned hawks as they come by on their migration. And I will see, in some cases, 20,000 hawks in a day, and maybe ban 70 or 80 of them. One of the things I love watching that migration down the eastern seaboard is that we see a steady line of monarch butterflies come down with the hawk migration. They follow the same migration routes because they look for updrafts. They know where the updrafts are along the ridgeways. And about 20 years ago, I saw that the monarchs were diminishing, and every year after that, they got smaller and smaller until 2 years went by where we literally did not see any. And by that time, we knew that it was Monsanto that was killing the milkweed, that was destroying the monarch butterflies, and many other species. Monsanto has acknowledged that there's 13 species that will probably go extinct in North America just because of its pesticide, and those are just sacrifices for all of our greater good. But at the same time, I was involved in a 30-year lawsuit against General Electric Company for dumping PCBs into the Hudson. And of course, all of those PCBs, 100% of them, were manufactured by Monsanto. And Monsanto knew that they caused cancer, and they knew that they were very, very early on that they caused IQ loss, and ultimately that they were endocrine disruptors, that a single molecule in a fish can diminish the IQ of a child, and it can change the sexual behavior of the child. As a result of that, I represented the fishermen on the Hudson River. We had about 2,000 fishing families, 350-year industry. You know, and Vendana talks about what this has done to the family farmer in India. But I watched personally my friends and clients be put out of work. Because in 1973, the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York State made it illegal to sell Hudson River fish. And this industry, the oldest fishing community in North America, 3.5 centuries, using the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam, and catching shad and sturgeon and herring and alewives and striped bass and tomcod and all these other fishes and blue crab. And suddenly all these men and women were out of work. And most of these people were people who wanted their children to fish the Hudson. Today, those children are hanging sheetrock or they're pouring asphalt because nobody works on the river anymore. And the Constitution of the state of New York says that the people of the state of New York own the fish in the Hudson River. And we own the water in the Hudson River. It's called the Public Trust Doctrine. This is a 2,000-year-old law. It goes back to the Code of Justinian. It's in the Magna Carta, but it's in the Constitution of every state that the people of the state own the fish in that state and the wandering animals. Today, legally, we own the fish, but we don't own them anymore. Monsanto now owns every fish in the Hudson River. It privatized a public resource. It turned them into profit for itself, and it took them away from us, so we can't use them anymore. And that's an act of theft. And all of these things that, that Vendana and Zen are talking about are crimes. This is to put glyphosate in, and by the way, what Vendana said about, we shouldn't be talking about glyphosate, we should be talking about Roundup. And if you read all of these documents that we've gotten from Monsanto and see all the sneaky stuff that they do, one of the most fearful things for them is that somebody is going to do testing on Roundup. Because even in their most private emails to each other, they're talking about nobody's ever tested this, and we know that the formulation is much, much more toxic than the glyphosate. Because the formulation has all these surfactants in it and adjuvants in it that are intended to allow the glyphosate to slip through the bark of the plant and through the coating of the plant, and they allow also those same chemicals also enable that molecule to penetrate the blood-brain barrier and get into the human system, and they're toxic themselves. And the synergistic toxicity is something they've been able to keep the regulatory agencies from ever looking at that. The only thing they ever test is pure glyphosate. Nobody ever gets to test Roundup. And of course, Roundup has many different formulations, but they're all much more toxic than glyphosate.